All right, welcome back. Another solo podcast. We're talking technical development over time. How and why do we work on technique over time? Enjoy this arm moving while you can. I've ruptured my bicep, getting surgery tomorrow. Keen to see how that goes. Can't wait. Anyway, let's talk about technique. So when I talk about technical development over time, I'm talking about how and why do we actually change a lifter's technique? Why is it important? Where does it sit in the hierarchy? And that's probably a really good place to start. How important is technique for the powerlifter? There are a lot of sort of back and forth arguments about technique and the elites, as in, is there such thing as perfect technique? If there is, what is that? Should we just let lifters move the way they move and lift however they lift? And the really tricky thing with this is that because there isn't a defined gold standard of technique, everyone's just literally making it up as they go along. So one expert or group of people is going to have an opinion based on their own anecdote or trust in the experts that they listen to. The other expert is going to have a differing opinion based on their anecdote, their thought processes, or the people that they trust that they listen to. Regardless, I believe that it's pretty clear cut that technique matters to some degree. And to me and to Zero and to what we do, I would say that technique sort of sits at the top of the pyramid. If you think about it, if we're talking about powerlifting, how you express your strength on the platform is determined by the way that you move. Like technique is the expression of strength, right? You very rarely fail because of strength in the main prime movers. So for example, you very rarely fail a squat because your legs are too weak to squat it up. You fail a squat because your legs aren't able to transfer power into the bar because of bottlenecks in technique. You lose your brace, you lose your upper back, you can't maintain tension in a particular area, so you change your position, and as a result, you're unable to stand up with the weight. That's why most people can leg press or hack squat much more than what they can actually squat. In an ideal world, that's because there are bottlenecks in the technique, inefficiencies in the technique that prevent them from expressing that strength. Now, I obviously believe that there is such thing as a gold standard. And my argument against people that would say that there isn't one and you should just let people move the way that they move is that you do have a gold standard. And the test for this is if I show you a technique that goes completely against what you believe to be true, you're going to say, we need to change your technique. We need to move that technique towards something else. What you really need to be asking yourself is, what is that something else? And can you define every single part of it? Because once you can, then you've got a picture of what your idea of a gold standard is, and you're kind of proving the point that that technique matters. That it isn't just figure out how to lift and let the body do what it does. There are things that you're moving towards. I don't like the idea of ranges, right? Like, a little bit of backgrounding's okay. Okay for what? See, the arguments of these little technical breakdowns often come from an injury perspective. And the back is a perfect example. Yeah, it's okay to move. You're not going to break your back if you round a little bit. I agree. What I care about with powerlifting is, can you lift more weight? And so if you're allowed to cave your knees in a little bit, if you're allowed to round your back a little bit, how much is okay before it becomes not okay? And I can show you plenty of examples where you'd probably look at it and say, that's too much rounding. That's too much knee cave. If there's too much, that means more or less of that thing is better, which means none of it is probably best, right? And it's about defining what that is and being able to articulate it. I'm just fortunate enough with Zero to have spent a lot of time thinking about this and to create what I believe to be the gold standard and to work towards it consistently and get continual feedback from the sample size. Anyway, that's not what this is about. What I really want to talk about, that just highlights technique is important, right? Technique matters whether you believe in gold standard and perfect technique or not. Technique matters. Technique impacts your, from a more, that's a more subjective point, right? From a more objective point, if we're talking about how does technique impact strength, there are only 3 things that you can train that contribute to getting stronger in the gym. Okay, so one is only 3 adaptations that you can make, I should say, that contribute to getting stronger. One is motor unit recruitment, one is hypertrophy, and the third is coordination or skill, which is the technical aspect, right? So technique will contribute to strength over time. The important part of that is technique in that context is relative to intensity. So it needs to be technical practice under high intensity or relatively high intensity, but technique matters towards getting stronger over time. So we're making a case right now of, is technique important? Yes, it is. Here's why it's important. It's how you express your strength, but it also contributes to getting stronger over time. So technique matters. That's the whole point there. Now, coming back to this idea of a gold standard, you may not believe in the idea of a gold standard, like I said, but you have to define what your ideal technique is, even if it has ranges within it, because you're going to be working towards that in some way, shape, or form. And that in some ways is going to impact how you program, right? So you might increase your frequency with the argument of skill, which, you can believe it or you cannot believe it. You might put in exercises with the argument that this will impact a certain area of technique. Like, technique is going to be a consideration when it comes to programming. It is going to factor into how you determine what you're going to program, the intensities, the rep ranges, the volumes, the frequency, all of that is going to contribute or work with technique, right? So from all of that grounding, from that foundation, the next step is, okay, we have an idea of where we want to go with technique. We understand the importance of technique. How do we now integrate this and build this into a lifter's progress over time? Because the real challenge here is, if you've got an idea of what perfect technique is, you've got a lifter in front of you that can't hold that technique above a certain intensity level. Above that intensity level, they fall apart, or they not fall apart, but they break down. It makes sense. The logical thought process makes sense to say, well, that breakdown is actually stronger. And it is at that particular point in time. You need to have a really clear idea of what perfect technique is so you can move the person towards that so they can maximize the best of both worlds, the strength they currently have or the strength they're building and their ability to express that strength. What's really challenging is knowing when to build in technical considerations, how hard to lean into them, and how to drive that process over time. So what I'm really trying to say here is, if a lifter has that breakdown point, let's say you're going into a peak, do you work on making it pretty and going towards that gold standard, or do you just let them lift and lift the most weight possible? This is the challenge with powerlifters, is that you're not going to make a technical change that just sticks and stays out there over time. You're constantly balancing between prioritizing performance, prioritizing movement, and it's not one or the other. It's just about how much of one thing or the other is present. That's the real challenge, because it requires a hell of a lot of experience in actually successfully doing this. So, for example, let's say you're working with a lifter, their shoulder control on bench press is just trash. Their elbows are all over the place. Their shoulders are all kinds of weird and wacky. And you're like, okay, well, we need to fix the shoulder position. So you lock them in, you get them to practice that. They're unable to do that to any real degree of intensity. Do you dial back the intensity completely to make it pretty, which sacrifices the intensity that they need to drive strength? Or do you prioritize strength and drive the intensity at the expense of it being pretty? Well, you can have the best of both worlds. And like I said, it's not, people, there was a big argument all the time, 5-10 years ago about, like, you're holding your clients back if you're trying to make their technique better. You just need to let them lift really heavy. There's an element of truth to that. You do need to train with high intensity, but you can be training with high intensity and be working on technique at the same time. And if anything, both of those things are kind of one and the same thing and need to feed off of each other. Look at it like this. You've got a technical max and you've got a true max, and you're trying to close the gap between your technical max and your true max. The technical max is the max that you can perform that movement to whatever you believe the ideal technique to be. The true max is what you can actually push on that movement when some of that technique breaks down. And that difference will change depending on the lifter. Some lifters, as you know from watching lifting, will have impeccable technique at a high intensity. Some lifters will have terrible technique, and even at a low intensity, it's quite hard to get them to move into better positions or what you believe to be better positions. You can play with this because often if we break it down and we look at it under a microscope, there are areas of technique that break down in the movement that create the visual degradation of that lift that can be worked on outside of the movement and implemented back into it very quickly. A really good example of this, I work with a lot of big, juicy, strong lifters, and their shoulder control is terrible. Over years, they've gotten really big and strong. Strength is not the issue. Position is the issue, and fixing position takes time. But as soon as you fix the position, the strength is already there. So you get this point where it's just like a magical change in technique where everything looks all of a sudden better and all the cueing makes sense. It takes time to get there, but it's the culmination of cueing that thing inside the movement and being okay with them trying to move in that direction and not successfully doing it, plus doing a lot of work outside of that lift to work on that specific area of weakness. This is why waving through intensities and toying with rep ranges on the main lift is important. The main lift in a powerlifting programming, in a powerlifting program, and this is going to be controversial, the main lift in a powerlifting program is very rarely the thing that's actually driving the strength. Because strength is primarily driven by hypertrophy. And the main lifts are not very good for hypertrophy. What we get out of the main lift is the skill. We maintain the skill of expressing our strength through that movement pattern, right? So why it's so important to wave through intensities and wave through rep ranges is because if you've got a lifter whose upper back in a squat breaks down at 80%, every time you're training under 80%, you're training at a high intensity of that particular breakdown. It's a unique opportunity to work on that particular breakdown. You can't just be lifting heavy all the time or you'll never change technique. You can't be lifting light all the time or you never challenge that technique under more appropriate intensities, which would carry over to a max lift scenario. So how do we actually manifest this over time? Well, we work on it in a variety of ways. So we wave through intensities like I was just saying. We build in a technical hierarchy into our programming. So you only fix a squat with a squat. You're only going to make a change to a squat in a squat. If somebody's knees are caving in and you're like, hey, get on the ground and do this banded clamshell, that is not going to make a change on the squat whatsoever. It's the person's ability to think about the right position in the squat that's going to matter. And so if their knees are caving in on 250 kilos and you're using a little skinny pink band to do clamshells, the pink band is not going to win that fight. The 250 kilos is. It's then up to the lifter to integrate that into the squat, which is what cueing is all about. So the lifter needs to be thinking about it in the main lift. That's why the main lift should always be there for a powerlifter. The next part of that chain, if we're like, okay, well, the main lift isn't cutting it, we're not seeing that change manifest, or the person isn't coordinated or strong enough to hold that position in the main lift, it's to go down a step. You don't go all the way to the bottom to the clamshell, you go down a step. We want them to be able to squat in a particular position, whereas the bottleneck for that, let's work within that bottleneck. And so that's when we're doing things like tempo work, pause work. But the really important part of that is if you're using tempo or pause work to address this particular breakdown, it has to be perfect. People say, oh, I'm doing a pause at the knee deadlift to fix my, this is where I lose my back position and that's why I can't lock out. And then they'll pause in the same shitty position that they fail at every single time. You're just reinforcing shitty technique. So if you're going to do pause work, tempo work, whatever, it has to be with the ideal technique that you're working towards. From there, you have to ask, okay, if I'm unable to still perform this well, or it needs more attention because it's always breaking down, how can I take that aspect out of the lift and work on it somewhere else? And this is where we go to machine work or base building work that has a like for like action. So you're able to get your body in the same position, you're able to load it relatively heavily, and you're able to justify it being in your program. So what I mean in English is if hips are the problem on squats and knees are caving in and going all over the place, you wouldn't go down to a leg extension, say I'm strengthening the quads. You should be doing that anyway. But if you're trying to fix the hips, chuck somebody on the leg press, get them in the same foot position, get them to watch their knees, remove the complication of breathing and bracing, of upper back tightness, of the barbell on the back, just focus solely on that particular issue. If somebody's shoulders suck on a bench press, get them to do a row through full range, the same specific range in the same specific position that you're looking for in the perfect position in your ideal world on the bench press. If somebody's back is breaking down in a deadlift, get them to do a good morning or an RDL, remove the complication of the setup process, of the movement from the floor, of the full range. Just go through that torso loading process in a perfect position relative to where you want them to be on the deadlift. performance and intensity is key when it comes to this level of problem solving or this level of technical integration. And so what really changes then over time is how hard you go down that rabbit hole depending on your phase in programming. So if you're in the real strength building real strength building phases, you need to have an element of focusing on high intensity in the main lift. And really, that should be the case all the time. It's just the lower intensity the main lift is. Like, let's say you're doing 8s at whatever it is, 70-something%. You've got an opportunity to really think about your technique. If you're doing triples at 90%, it's about fucking doing a heavy triple at 90%. You're still thinking about execution, yes, but the important part is getting the intensity. So if you're in that sort of phase, then you're going to probably double down a little bit more on making, the leg press perfect, or the RDL or the row or whatever exercise you're using to perfect technique perfect. You're focusing on intensity in the main lift and performance on the secondary lifts or the accessory lifts. So you're kind of just turning up and down the dial on intensity and putting the blinders on and off on how something looks depending on how far you are out from competition. So leading into competition, you probably don't want somebody hyper obsessing about their technique. In those last 2 or 3 blocks leading in, you might remove some of the heavy technical focus with tempo work, or some of the heavy technical focus with, perfect this and perfect that, and just focus on execution. Just focus on execution of intensity. Then straight after the comp, lower intensity, ramping up the technique work. You're just kind of turning it on and off and on and off and watching over time as the technique catches up to the absolute max. Anyway, I hope that helps. It's really just a small snippet into what you could be doing in order to improve technique and how to build it into programming. Now, obviously, I'm speaking very broadly because there are so many ways you can do this, and the context is going to change depending on the lifter, on their experience level, on how big or nasty the technical breakdown is. But I hope that helps. Enjoy.